So we got started with the text input. Right now we're not doing anything with the values the user enters. But before we do that, let's make sure that actually the button is not below that input, but next to it on the right. And for that, again, we need to work on the layout. That's why I have this extra view here around the text input and the button. We wouldn't need that, but now with that nested view, we can control how these two items are aligned to each other by, again, adding the style property here. And now, for layouting, for positioning things, React Native uses Flexbox, which you also might know from the web in case you don't, attached to find resources that get you started with CSS Flexbox. You don't need to know Flexbox in and out, but it helps to know a bit about it. Flexbox works such that it positions elements inside of a view next to each other or above each other. By default, above each other in React Native. You can change that by setting flex direction from column, which is the default, to row. And by just adding this on this view, we override the default, which is, well, the default, which is why we don't have to set it, of column. And now already we'll see that the button and the text input sit next to each other. Doesn't look that great yet, but they're sitting next to each other. Now, to make that look better, we can also add more. For example, you can define how things are aligned and distributed in their row or column. For example, with justify content, you can control how items are distributed along their main axis. And with row, the main axis is from left to right. If that would be column, the main axis would be from top to bottom. So now we could specify a value, and here my IDE even gives me auto completion, which is very convenient. We could specify a value of space between, for example. What this means is that all the remaining free space is between the two elements. So they're now not sitting directly next to each other, but instead there is some free space between them, as you can tell. Now we can also align them on their cross axis. So main axis for flex direction row was left to right. Cross axis then is top to bottom. For flex direction column, the main axis would be top to bottom and the cross axis would be left to right. So the cross axis simply is the opposite of the main axis, so to say. Justify content positions along the main axis. With align items, you can control how the child elements of this view are aligned along the cross axis. There you have different values, like for example, center. So in this case, since we have flex direction row, this should vertically center all items, which means that the button now looks nicer and is simply centered there in the middle of this input. Well, and now we can also ramp up the width of that input a little bit by going to the text input, and there on the style, we can also add a width of, let's say, 200 to give this a width of 200 pixels, which means that this now is a bit bigger. Alternatively, by the way, you could have also chosen a percentage value like 80%, which means that this takes 80% of the available width made available by its parent component, so by the view that surrounds it. And now with that, we had a look at the first important fundamentals about laying things out in React Native and styling things. But right now we're doing all of that with that concept called inline styles, which means we're setting up the styles directly on the elements. And that's not ideal.